Beneath the same sky that watched over the first native tribes, the daring settlers and the dreamers who crossed oceans for a new beginning, the story of America unfolds. It's a story of hope and heartbreak, unity and division, courage and contradiction. From the whispering plains to the crowded city streets, every corner of this land carries an echo of struggle and triumph. Under the same sky isn't just history. It's a mirror of humanity's endless search for freedom, belonging, and identity. It's the tale of how millions came together, and sometimes apart, to build a nation that continues to redefine what it means to be American. Under the vast stretch of sky that covered the untouched continent, before borders, before nations, before the idea of America even existed, there lived the first peoples, the true guardians of the land. Their roots were deep not only in the soil but in the spirit of the earth itself. Every mountain, river, and forest held meaning. Every animal carried wisdom. To them, the land was not something to own, but something to belong to, a living, breathing relative whose rhythms were intertwined with their own. The story of the First Nations begins not with conquest or exploration, but with balance. For thousands of years, long before the sails of foreign ships appeared on distant horizons, the continent flourished with diverse tribes, each with its own culture, language, and traditions. From the icy tundras of the north to the sun-drenched deserts of the southwest, they built communities that reflected the world around them. The Haudenosaunee formed intricate confederacies that valued consensus and unity. The Pueblo people raised cities of stone that still stand as silent witnesses to their brilliance. Along the Mississippi, great mound builders shaped the earth into sacred forms, reaching toward the heavens as if in conversation with the sky itself. They were storytellers, astronomers, and philosophers. They charted the movements of the stars, told tales that carried moral wisdom across generations, and understood the cycles of life long before science could define them. In every story there was respect for the rivers that nourished them, the animals that fed them, the winds that guided them. Their myths were not simply tales of gods and spirits. They were lessons in coexistence. The buffalo was not just a resource but a teacher. The eagle, soaring high, was a messenger between earth and sky. The trees whispered of patience. The stones remembered time. Across the plains, the Lakota would speak of the interconnectedness of all things, that every being, from the crawling insect to the great thundercloud, shared the same essence. This belief, known as Mitakuye Oyasing, all my relations, formed the foundation of their world. It wasn't philosophy, it was a way of being. To harm the land was to harm oneself. To take more than one needed was a betrayal of balance. In the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit and Haida carved totems that told the stories of their clans, not as decoration, but as sacred memory. Each symbol was a chapter, each carving a connection between ancestors and descendants. These were living histories, standing tall against the passage of time, reminding every generation of where they came from and what they must honor. In the arid lands of the Southwest, the Hopi tended to their crops with rituals of gratitude. Corn for them was not just sustenance, it was life itself, a sacred gift that demanded humility and care. Each seed planted carried a prayer, and each harvest was celebrated with dances that echoed through the desert winds. Life was not easy, but it was meaningful. Seasons dictated survival, yet survival was intertwined with spirituality. There was no separation between the sacred and the mundane. Every act, from hunting to weaving, carried spiritual weight. To the First Nations, the world was alive and they were a part of its song. Then came the horizon's shadow, sails appearing like ghosts across the water. The arrival of Europeans brought more than trade. It brought disruption, disease, and the beginning of unimaginable loss. The first encounters were marked by curiosity, even generosity. Many tribes welcomed the newcomers, teaching them how to grow corn, navigate rivers, and survive the harsh winters. But the balance they had maintained for centuries would soon be fractured. The settlers' view of the land was different. To them, land was property, a resource to be claimed and cultivated. The forests were not sacred. They were lumber. The rivers were not veins of life. They were routes to profit. What had once been shared space became territory. Lines were drawn where none had existed before, and with those lines came conflict. The First Nations faced a force that did not understand their way of life. Treaties were made and broken. Sacred grounds were taken and renamed. With every step westward, the newcomers left a trail of displacement. The buffalo herds that once thundered across the plains were slaughtered by the millions, not for need, but for domination. For the Lakota, who depended on those herds, it was not just starvation, it was the erasure of their way of life. Yet even in loss, their spirit endured. The tribes resisted not just with weapons, but with resilience. They preserved their stories, their songs, their ceremonies, sometimes in secret, sometimes in defiance. Elders became living libraries carrying the memory of entire nations in their hearts. In the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee were forced to march westward from their ancestral lands, there was unimaginable suffering. But even then they sang. They carried with them the seeds of their traditions, the language of their ancestors, and the faith that the earth would remember them. And she did. In every generation, the First Nations found ways to adapt without surrendering the essence of who they were. Their languages, nearly silenced by assimilation and colonial policies, began to rise again through revival movements. Songs once forbidden are now sung in schools and at powwows. The drumming, steady as a heartbeat, still echoes across the land. Today, their wisdom has become a voice the modern world desperately needs to hear again. As the planet faces ecological crises, deforestation, pollution, the collapse of natural balance, the teachings of the First Nations resonate louder than ever. They remind us that the earth is not a resource to exhaust, but a relative to protect. The idea of stewardship, sustainability, and harmony with nature are not modern inventions. They are ancient truths, kept alive by the very people once dismissed as primitive. Every river still carries their reflection. Every mountain still holds their spirit. The languages may have changed, cities may have risen where sacred lands once stood, but the soul of the first peoples remains woven into the fabric of the continent. When the wind sweeps across the plains or whispers through the redwoods, it carries fragments of their songs, songs of gratitude, courage, and remembrance. Their connection to the sky remains too. The stars that guided their ancestors still shine above us, unchanged, eternal. To look up at them is to see what they saw. The same constellations, the same vast mystery. It is a reminder that the sky connects us all, across time and culture. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is still, one might imagine hearing their prayers rise from the earth. The low hum of the drum, the rhythm of feet in sacred dance, the soft chant of gratitude to the four directions. These are not echoes of a forgotten past. They are living voices, still calling us to remember that we are part of something greater than ourselves. For America, their story is not a prelude to history. It is the foundation of it. Before independence, before the Constitution, before the idea of freedom was written on parchment, freedom already lived in the hearts of those who walked this land. Freedom not as ownership, but as balance. Freedom in belonging, in understanding the sacred duty to care for what gives us life. The First Nations remind us that progress without respect is destruction. And civilization without harmony is emptiness. They teach that true wisdom lies not in how much we take, but in how much we give back. And so, when we speak of America's beginnings, we must not start with 1776. We must begin with the people who understood this land long before it was called America. Their journey was not one of conquest, but of coexistence. They did not build empires. They built relationships with the sky, the soil, and the spirit of every living thing. Under that same sky, their story continues. Children learn their languages once more. Artists paint their legends. Elders tell the stories of the great turtle, the sacred mountains, the rivers that never forgot their names. Each act of remembrance is an act of resistance, a refusal to let time erase truth. In the end, the First Nations' greatest gift is not their endurance alone, but their reminder of what humanity can be when it lives in respect. Their story is not just the story of the past, it is the heartbeat of the present, the whisper of the future. For when all is said and done, when cities crumble and borders fade, the land will remain. The rivers will still flow, the wind will still move, and the stars will still shine over the same sky. The sky that once watched over the guardians of the land. And beneath that eternal sky, their spirit still walks. And beneath that eternal sky, their spirit still walks. Across the prairies where grass bends with the wind, through the forests that breathe in ancient rhythm, their footsteps remain. Quiet, yet enduring. Each step carries a memory, each echo a story. These are not ghosts of a forgotten world, but living spirits whispering through time, reminding us that this land has always been alive long before it was claimed, fenced, or renamed. Their world was not divided into maps or borders. It was woven through relationship, between the people, the land, and the unseen forces that shaped existence. The First Nations understood that life flowed in circles. The seasons turned, the rivers carved, the herds moved, and in each movement there was a lesson. Birth and death were not opposites, but part of the same sacred dance. Everything returned to the earth, and from the earth everything rose again. Around firelight, elders told stories that connected the young to the old, the living to the ancestors. These stories were not entertainment. They were sacred threads binding the generations. In them, animals spoke, stars guided, and spirits walked beside men. The story of the great turtle told how the earth was formed on the back of a gentle creature that carried the weight of the world with patience. The raven, mischievous and clever, taught the value of curiosity and wit. The coyote, both trickster and teacher, revealed that wisdom often hides behind folly. To listen to these tales was to understand the balance of life, the humility in laughter, the reverence in survival. The young learned that every being, no matter how small, had a place in the great circle. Even the rocks, it was said, held memory. They remembered storms, fires, and footsteps. The rivers were storytellers, carrying the reflections of ages in their flow. In the northern forests, tribes followed the migration of caribou, taking only what they needed. When a hunt was successful, they gave thanks, not in words alone, but in ceremony. Offerings were made to the spirit of the animal. Songs were sung to honor its gift of life. Nothing was wasted, for to waste was to insult the earth. Further south, along the great rivers, the Mississippian cultures built vast mound cities aligned with the stars. These were not random constructions, but expressions of cosmic harmony. They understood that the sky above and the ground below mirrored each other, that humanity lived suspended between heaven and earth. In every mound, every carving, there was geometry born of reverence, not dominance. When the first contact with Europeans began, it was not immediately war. It was curiosity exchange, a cautious dance between worlds. Gifts were shared and corn for steel, furs for cloth, words for wonder. For a moment it seemed that two worlds could meet in peace, but as more ships arrived carrying hunger for land and power, the balance began to break. The newcomers saw abundance as opportunity, not sacredness. Forests became lumber, rivers became borders, people became obstacles. The First Nations watched as their world began to shrink, not by the hand of nature but by the will of man. Still, they adapted. They negotiated treaties in good faith, believing that promises were sacred. But words written on paper did not hold the same weight as a spoken oath sealed by ceremony. Again and again, treaties were broken. The ink on one page could erase entire homelands. The land, once vast and open, became confined to reservations, fragments of what once was infinite. Yet even in confinement, the people's spirit refused to fade. Around small fires, the old songs continued. The children still learned the stories. And the stars, they still shone constant and kind above a changing world. The pain of loss became a song of endurance. The Trail of Tears was one such song, a sorrow carried across thousands of miles through hunger, sickness, and death. But within that suffering, a spark remained. The Cherokee who walked that trail carried seeds in their pockets, the seeds of corn and memory. Even when forced from their homes, they carried the promise of life, the essence of who they were. Across the plains, the Sioux fought not just for land, but for their way of life. At the Little Bighorn, for one brief moment, the tide turned. The warriors, united under the vision of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, struck back against a force that seemed unstoppable. It was not victory born of conquest, but of conviction, a defense of identity, of sacred duty. Yet even that moment was fleeting. The machinery of empire was relentless. By the end of the 19th century, much of the First Nations land was gone, their numbers diminished by disease, war, and forced assimilation. The boarding schools came next, institutions designed to kill the Indian and save the man. Children were taken from their families, their hair cut, their languages silenced. They were taught to forget who they were. But memory, like roots beneath the soil, cannot be erased so easily. Even in silence, stories survived. In whispers and secret prayers, the old words lived on. A grandmother teaching her grandchild a song in the quiet of night. A father telling the legend of the thunderbird before sleep. These acts of love became acts of resistance. And so the people endured. In the 20th century, new voices rose, strong, unyielding, proud. From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, the spirit of the ancestors stirred again. The drumbeats that once echoed through the plains returned, not as relics of the past but as declarations of survival. The First Nations were not vanishing. They were awakening. Today, across North America, the revival continues. Young people learn the languages once nearly lost. Ceremonies once outlawed are celebrated openly. Elders share wisdom through digital screens, bridging ancient teachings with modern hearts. The land, though scarred, still welcomes their footsteps. Their art flourishes again. Intricate beadwork that tells stories of resilience, paintings that merge tradition with contemporary vision, songs that blend the old chants with new rhythms. Each creation is both remembrance and rebirth. Their philosophy, once dismissed, has become a guiding light in a world facing ecological collapse. The First Nations' understanding that the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth, now echoes through classrooms, environmental movements, and international forums. What was once considered primitive is now recognized as prophetic. When we speak of climate change, of sustainability, of finding balance again, we are, knowingly or not, returning to the wisdom they carried all along. A wisdom that was never lost, only unheard. If one stands in silence in the heart of nature, on a mountain ridge at dawn, or beside a river flowing under moonlight, one might feel it, that ancient connection still alive beneath the noise of modern life. The heartbeat of the drum still pulses in the wind, The spirit of the first people still moves in the rhythm of the earth. Their teachings call us to remember that progress without reverence leads to ruin. That every gain made at the cost of harmony is not victory but loss. They remind us that the world is not a collection of resources but a family of beings. To the First Nations, the future is not a distant dream. It is the continuation of a sacred trust. The land we walk upon is borrowed from our children, not inherited from our ancestors. Every action, every choice, must honor that responsibility. In powwows today, as dancers circle beneath open skies, their regalia shines like the sun itself, each bead, feather, and color carrying meaning. The circle they form is ancient and eternal, representing the cycles of life, the unity of all creation. As the drums thunder and voices rise, it feels as though time folds, past and present merging. The ancestors watching, smiling, proud, under that same sky, where centuries ago the first fires burned. The song continues. It is the song of endurance, of belonging, of love for the earth. The story of the First Nations is not one of disappearance, but of return, a return to truth, to balance, to the deep knowing that we are not separate from the world, but part of it. Their journey, stretching across millennia, stands as both memory and mirror, showing what humanity was and what it must become again. For the First Nations, being human is not to conquer the earth, but to walk gently upon it, to listen, to give thanks. And as the modern world races forward, forgetting its roots, their voice still calls softly. Remember the land, remember the sky, remember who you are, because in the end, all of us, and no matter where we come from, stand beneath that same sky. The same stars that guided their ancestors now guide us. The same winds that carried their prayers still move through our world. Their story, the story of the guardians of the land, is the beginning of America, and perhaps if we listen, the salvation of its spirit. And so the sky watches still, vast, patient, eternal, as the people rise again, as the drums call, as the land breathes and the story continues. The ocean was restless, a wide, endless mirror of the sky, vast, cold, and filled with promise. Across it came ships, small and fragile against the weight of eternity, carrying souls who dared to dream of something more. They came with fear in their hearts and faith in their hands, guided by stars they barely understood. Each wave carried them closer to an unknown world, one whispered about in taverns and pulpits, a land of endless forests, boundless opportunity, and the fragile hope of freedom. When their ships finally touched the unfamiliar shores, silence met them. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and earth, the cry of unseen birds echoing through endless trees. To those weary travelers, it felt as though they had arrived in the very heart of God's creation. Yet they did not step into an empty world. Beneath those same trees lived the first peoples, who had walked these lands for countless generations, whose stories were woven into the rivers and mountains. For them, this was not a discovery. It was an arrival of strangers, of change, of destiny wrapped in sails. At first, the newcomers came humbly, building small wooden settlements that clung to the edge of survival. They faced hunger, disease, and winters that bit through bone and faith alike. It was often the kindness of the indigenous tribes that kept them alive, teaching them what the soil would yield, how to fish the rivers, how to read the seasons. But soon humility gave way to hunger, not the hunger of the body but of ambition. The new arrivals saw not a living land but an open canvas. The forest was timber. The soil was wealth. The people were obstacles or souls to be converted. Slowly, the dream of refuge became the dream of dominion. Colonies multiplied, stretching like roots across the coast. In each settlement, a new fragment of Europe took shape. New England, New Amsterdam, New Spain, New France. the old world reborn in the new. But beneath these names, the land still whispered its original tongue, ancient and unbroken. The colonists carried with them old wounds and old chains. Many came seeking freedom, from tyranny, persecution, or poverty. Yet they brought with them the same hierarchies they fled. The dream of liberty lived uneasily beside the reality of control. Some built communities rooted in faith and equality, others in exploitation and greed. As tobacco fields and sugar plantations grew, so too did the slave ships. The same ocean that brought seekers of freedom now carried the enslaved in chains. Their cries lost to the wind became part of the story, a haunting reminder that every empire is built on contradiction. In the bustling ports of Boston, Charleston, and Philadelphia, a new identity began to form. Colonists no longer saw themselves as merely Europeans abroad. They were something different now, shaped by the wilderness, hardened by labor, and united by the vastness of the land. The Atlantic no longer divided them from home. It defined the distance between who they were and who they were becoming. Yet the shadow of empire lingered. Across that same ocean, kings and parliaments demanded obedience, taxing the colonies, regulating their trade, deciding their fate without their voice. The seeds of rebellion were planted not in anger, but in exhaustion, the slow realization that those who worked the land, who fought its storms and tilled its soil, were ruled by men who had never seen it. The whispers of dissent began in the taverns, in pamphlets, in the quiet corners of marketplaces. Words became weapons carried on ink and conviction. Liberty, independence, equality. They were dangerous words, but intoxicating. The colonists were no longer simply settlers. They were thinkers, rebels, visionaries. And in the distance, the sound of an approaching storm could be heard. When the first shot was fired at Lexington, it echoed not just across the fields of Massachusetts, but across history. Farmers and blacksmiths, students and soldiers, stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the might of an empire that spanned continents. Their muskets were old, their training poor, but their cause was fire. They fought for something that could not yet be named, the right to shape their own destiny. The struggle that followed was brutal and uncertain. The war was fought not only on battlefields, but in the hearts of those who lived through it. Families were torn apart, villages burned. The winter at Valley Forge tested the limits of human endurance. Men barefoot in the snow, driven by hope more than rations. Yet amid the cold and hunger they held on. George Washington's army was less an army of soldiers than of believers, believers in a vision not yet written. While musket smoke filled the air, ideas burned brighter still. Across the colonies, thinkers and dreamers gathered to define the shape of a new world. What if government existed not to rule but to serve? What if power came not from birth but from the consent of the governed? These were radical thoughts, dangerous, heretical even, but they gave the rebellion purpose. Then, in the summer of 1776, a declaration was written, not just for a nation, but for an idea. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," it began, and in those words a new world took its first breath. The parchment bore ink, but it also bore blood. It spoke of liberty and equality, yet many who signed it owned slaves. It declared freedom from tyranny while ignoring the freedom of those displaced from their lands. The document was pure in vision but flawed in practice, a mirror reflecting both light and shadow. Still, it changed everything. The colonies became a nation, fragile and uncertain, but alive. The revolution ended one form of rule and began another. The old world fell away, and from its ashes rose something that had never existed before. A republic born not of bloodline, but of belief. But the struggle did not end with victory. The revolution's promise was incomplete, its dream divided. The new nation spoke of freedom, but half its people lived in bondage. It celebrated equality but denied it to women, to Native Americans, to the enslaved. The contradictions of its birth would haunt it for centuries, yet within those contradictions lay its strength, the constant tension between what it was and what it aspired to be. America was not a finished idea, but a living one, always reaching, always struggling, always redefining itself. The dream and the struggle were one and the same. In the years that followed, the nation expanded westward, guided by faith in manifest destiny, a belief that the land itself was theirs to claim. Once again, the dream of freedom turned into conquest. The same pattern repeated, hope shadowed by harm, progress built upon displacement. The new republic carried forward the very injustices it had once fought against. But through it all, voices rose, voices that refused to let the promise die. Abolitionists, poets, preachers, and revolutionaries of every color and creed kept alive the flame first lit in that summer of independence. They spoke of freedom not as a privilege but as a right. They challenged the hypocrisy of liberty for some and chains for others. Even those who had been silenced, the enslaved, the indigenous, the poor, carried the dream in their hearts. Through song, through faith, through generations of endurance, they held on to the vision of a nation that might one day live up to its own words. The revolution, then, was not a single war but a continual awakening, a fire passed from hand to hand. It burned in the hearts of those who crossed the ocean seeking refuge. It burned in the men and women who stood on the battlefield. And it burned still in those who came after, demanding that freedom mean what it promised. The struggle for independence was as much spiritual as political. It forced the people to ask who they were, what they believed, and what they were willing to sacrifice. Freedom was not given. It was earned, often at unbearable cost. The thousands who died did so not only for a flag, but for a future they would never see. As the last cannon fell silent and peace returned, the land itself seemed to breathe again. Fields once torn by war began to bloom. The cities rebuilt. The people, weary yet proud, looked upon their new nation with awe and uncertainty. They had broken the chains of kings, but freedom, they soon realized, was not an ending. It was a beginning. A nation born in struggle must always wrestle with its conscience. The ideals of the revolution would be tested again and again, in the fight against slavery, in the cries for women's rights, in the long road toward equality for all. Each generation would inherit the same question: what does freedom truly mean? And so the dream continued, restless, evolving, imperfect. The same sky that had watched over the first ships now watched over a nation trying to find its soul. Beneath that sky, farmers tilled their fields. Children learned new alphabets, preachers thundered of destiny, and the wind carried both hope and doubt. In the quiet of night, when all else fell silent, perhaps one could still hear the sound of those first waves, the creak of wood against wind, the whispers of men and women who dared to believe that across the ocean lay something better. They could not have known that their dream would become both blessing and burden, a light to the world, and a struggle that would never end. Because the American story, like all great human stories, is not about perfection. It is about the pursuit of it. The dream and the struggle are threads of the same tapestry, woven through courage and contradiction, sacrifice and hope. And under the same sky that once reflected the sails of explorers and the smoke of revolution, the journey continues. The dreamers still rise, the rebels still speak, and the struggle, though changed in form, remains eternal. For freedom once born can never truly rest. It demands to be lived, to be defended, to be redefined. It is the heartbeat of the American journey, restless, enduring, unbroken. Under a sky darkened by smoke and sorrow, the nation stood on the edge of its own reflection. The dream that had once united it, the dream of freedom, of equality, of destiny, now trembled beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The promise that all men are created equal had always been written in ink but not in truth. Beneath the shining words of liberty lay the old shadow, the bondage of millions. The same soil that grew wheat and cotton also bore the scars of the enslaved. The drums of progress beat beside the cracking of the whip. For decades the question had been whispered, then debated, then shouted. How could a nation built on freedom survive while denying it to so many? The founding dream was noble, but the wound was deep, and it festered beneath every compromise, every law, every uneasy peace. By the middle of the 19th century, the wound had become a chasm. In the fields of the South, human beings labored from dawn to dusk, their backs bent beneath a sun that gave them no mercy. The plantations were kingdoms of cruelty disguised as prosperity. Every bale of cotton, every drop of sugar was soaked in the sweat and blood of those who had no choice. They sang songs not of joy but of survival. Hymns carried through the night, voices rising in defiance to a heaven that seemed both silent and near. Their music became the soul of endurance, the heartbeat of a people who refused to be erased. In the North, cities swelled with factories and immigrants, with thinkers and abolitionists who dared to question the morality of the system that had made their nation rich. Printing presses thundered with pamphlets and sermons, calling for the end of slavery, for the recognition of the enslaved as brothers and sisters, not property. But even among them prejudice lingered. Freedom was championed in theory, yet equality remained an unfinished promise. The politicians argued, states divided, and families split. The question of slavery became the question of America itself. What did the nation truly stand for? Could liberty exist alongside bondage? Could unity survive such a moral divide? When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the fragile balance shattered. To the South, his victory signaled the end of their world. To the North, it was a step toward redemption. One by one, the Southern states seceded, declaring themselves a new nation, the Confederate States of America, built not on liberty, but on its denial. And as the winter of 1861 fell upon the land, the storm that had long been brewing finally broke. The first shots rang out at Fort Sumter, and the sky over Charleston burned with fire. What began as a political crisis became a war that would claim more American lives than any before or since. Brother fought against brother, father against son. The same flag that once symbolized unity now flew over divided camps. The early months of war were filled with arrogance and illusion. Both sides believed it would be quick, that honor and courage alone would decide it. They were wrong. The land became a graveyard of innocence. From Bull Run to Antietam, from Shiloh to Gettysburg, fields once green with life turned red with sacrifice. The cannons thundered across hills and valleys, and the smoke of gunpowder mingled with the cries of the dying. In the hospitals, men lay shattered and silent. Doctors worked by candlelight, their hands trembling, their hearts hardened by necessity. For every victory there was loss, for every cause a cost. The war was no longer about glory, it was about endurance. As the conflict deepened, so too did its meaning. What had begun as a fight to preserve the Union became a struggle for the nation's soul. Lincoln, solemn and weary, came to see that the war was not only about keeping states together, but about redefining what those states stood for. If slavery is not wrong, he wrote, nothing is wrong. His words cut through the fog of politics like light through smoke. In 1863, as soldiers fell by the thousands, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a document both symbolic and seismic, a promise that from the ashes of war, freedom would rise. Though it did not end slavery overnight, it transformed the conflict. The Union Army was no longer fighting only to preserve the nation, but to redeem it. The enslaved, hearing of their liberation, fled plantations to join the fight. They took up arms wearing the uniform of a country that had long denied them, yet one they still believed in. The war became not just a battle between armies, but a test of faith. Faith in the idea that justice, however delayed, could still be born. The fields of Gettysburg bore witness to that faith. For 3 days in the summer of 1863, the land trembled beneath the roar of cannon and musket. The battle left over 50,000 dead or wounded. When the smoke cleared, the air hung heavy with death and silence. Months later, Lincoln stood upon that sacred ground and spoke words that would echo through time. That this nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, must not perish from the earth. Those words were not merely for the dead. They were for the living, for a nation still struggling to understand its own meaning. The war raged on. Towns were reduced to ashes, railroads torn apart, families scattered. The South bled, but its leaders clung to a dream already dying. The North suffered too, burdened by loss, by doubt, by the haunting question of whether unity was worth such cost. In the midst of destruction, acts of compassion still flickered like candles in the dark. Nurses tended to enemy soldiers as if they were their own sons. Soldiers from opposite sides shared water in the chaos of battle. Even amid hatred, humanity refused to vanish. Then came the spring of 1865, the final weary march toward the end. The Confederate capital of Richmond fell, its streets burning under the weight of defeat. In the small town of Appomattox, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. There was no celebration, only silence. Grant, understanding the gravity of the moment, ordered his men to salute their former enemies. The war was over, but peace was fragile. Just days later, as the nation began to breathe again, tragedy struck. Abraham Lincoln, the man who had carried the burden of the nation's pain, was struck down by an assassin's bullet. In the theater, where laughter had filled the air, the dreamer of freedom fell silent. The news spread like thunder. The country had lost its guide, its conscience, its quiet strength. Bells tolled in every city and town. Black-clad mourners lined the streets as his body was carried home. Yet even in death his vision endured. The war had ended, but the struggle was far from over. The South lay in ruins, cities broken, fields scorched, people starved. 4 million newly freed men and women stepped into a world that had no place prepared for them. Their chains were gone, but their path was uncertain. They built schools where none had existed, formed churches, communities, and governments, determined to claim the dignity long denied them. But resistance remained fierce. Freedom on paper did not mean freedom in life. The scars of slavery, both visible and invisible, would not fade easily. Reconstruction was a battlefield of its own, a fight to define what the new America would be. For a brief, shining moment there was progress. Black voices entered the halls of power. Laws were written to protect the rights of the newly free. But the old forces of hatred soon rose again, wearing new faces. The Ku Klux Klan emerged from the shadows, terrorizing those who dared to dream of equality. The same soil that had seen emancipation became stained once more by violence. The North turned its gaze elsewhere. The nation wanted to heal, but too often healing meant forgetting. The freedmen were left vulnerable, their hopes betrayed by the very country that had promised them liberty. The dream of equality receded into the background, waiting for another generation to reclaim it. Still, something unbreakable had changed. The idea that all were created equal could no longer be denied. It had been written not only in documents, but in the blood of those who fought for it. Every grave, every tear, every act of courage became part of the nation's moral inheritance. As the years passed, the scars of war grew over, but the memories remained. The veterans aged, their bodies frail, but their stories fierce. The songs of the enslaved evolved into the hymns of hope that would one day become the soundtrack of civil rights. The children of those who had suffered carried forward the light of freedom, a light that would ignite again in Selma, in Montgomery, in Washington, a century later. The Civil War did not end the struggle. It transformed it. It forced the nation to face its reflection and decide again and again who it wanted to be. The Union survived, but it was not the same. It had been baptized in fire, and from the ashes rose a new understanding. Imperfect, unfinished, but alive. The fields that once bore cannon fire now bloom with wheat and memory. The rivers that once ran red with blood now carry the reflections of bridges, of cities, of generations who have built and rebuilt in the shadow of that great divide. And still, under the same sky, the question endures. What is liberty? What is equality? Can a nation truly be united when the wounds of its past still ache beneath its skin? The answers shift with time, yet the pursuit remains. The Civil War was not simply a conflict of soldiers and states. It was a confrontation with conscience. It revealed the cost of hypocrisy and the price of progress. It showed that ideals are fragile, but faith in them can be stronger than any weapon. Out of its darkness came a new dawn, one where freedom expanded, where the impossible became inevitable. The dream of equality, once confined to parchment, took root in the hearts of millions. Though incomplete, it lived, and so the nation carried on, scarred but standing, divided yet determined. The ghosts of that war still walk the fields, whispering through the grass, reminding those who listen that unity is not given. It is earned. From the ashes of its own destruction, America learned a painful truth, that liberty is not a destination, but a struggle renewed in every generation. The Civil War tore the nation apart, but it also forged its soul, and beneath that vast, unchanging sky the promise still endures, imperfect, unbroken, eternal, that all are created equal, and that the journey toward that truth is the story of America itself. They came from every corner of the earth, carrying little more than dreams and determination. Across oceans and generations they followed whispers of hope, of a land where anyone could begin again, where the weight of the past could be left behind on distant shores. The air of America, they had heard, was filled with opportunity, its soil rich not only with harvest but with promise. Yet for most the promise came wrapped in struggle, and the dream was something earned through sweat, endurance, and faith in tomorrow. The ships that carried them were crowded and cold. Whole families huddled in the dim lower decks, children pressed against their mothers, eyes wide with both fear and wonder. Above, the waves thundered like distant drums, as if the sea itself tested their resolve. And then, one morning, the cry would echo across the decks. Land. Faces turned upward, and in the mist the statue rose, torch raised high, a beacon of welcome and warning. To millions who passed beneath her gaze, the Statue of Liberty was not just a monument. She was a mother of second chances, her light guiding them toward a new life. Ellis Island became the threshold of the American story. Beneath its grand arches, dreams were examined alongside luggage. Names were changed. Languages stumbled through, hearts pounded with uncertainty. For some, the gates opened easily. For others, they closed without mercy. Doctors inspected faces for illness. Officers checked papers and questioned origins. Yet for those who passed through, stepping onto the streets of New York felt like stepping into a living heartbeat. The city pulsed with noise, motion, and ambition. Horses clattered over cobblestone. Smoke rose from factories, and tenement buildings stretched toward the sky like crowded hopes. The newcomers found work wherever hands were needed, in mills and mines, in railroads and slaughterhouses, in kitchens and sweatshops. Days were long and wages low, but even the smallest coin earned with freedom was worth more than the gold of oppression left behind. In the textile mills of Massachusetts, women worked by the hum of machines, their fingers raw but their spirits strong. In the steel mills of Pittsburgh, men toiled beside molten fire, their sweat mingling with the sparks of progress. In the coal mines of Pennsylvania, young boys carried lamps into the earth's darkness, learning too soon what it meant to labor and endure. They came from Ireland, fleeing famine, from Italy seeking dignity, from Poland, Russia, and Germany, escaping poverty and persecution. Chinese laborers built railroads through mountains, enduring prejudice and violence to connect a nation coast to coast. Mexican families crossed borders that once crossed them, harvesting fields under a relentless sun. Each group brought with them songs, faiths, foods, and customs, threads that together began to weave the vast tapestry of what America was becoming. But for every dream realized, another was crushed under hardship. The slums of the cities overflowed. Disease and hunger haunted the narrow streets of immigrant neighborhoods. Children played among refuse, mothers worked themselves to exhaustion, and men slept in shifts, sharing the same bed across 24 hours. Prejudice lurked behind every opportunity. No Irish need apply, the signs read. Chinamen keep out. Jews not welcome. The melting pot was not always kind to those being melted. Yet amid the struggle there was resilience, the quiet, unyielding kind that builds nations. Immigrants formed communities, each preserving a piece of the old world while learning to survive in the new. Italian bakeries filled the air with warmth and bread. Jewish tailors stitched futures from worn cloth. Irish workers built the very roads and bridges upon which others walked. And though they spoke in different tongues, they shared a common language: hope. As cities expanded, so did the engines of industry. The hum of machines became the anthem of a new age. Steam and steel-powered progress, and the skyline rose higher with every passing year. Railroads stitched the continent together, carrying coal, cattle, and dreams from one end to the other. Factories roared through the night, their chimneys marking the dawn of modern America. But progress demanded a price. The hands that turned the gears were often broken and unseen. The wealth of the few was built on the exhaustion of the many. Industrialists, men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan, became legends of ambition and control, shaping the destiny of the nation with steel, oil, and finance. They were hailed as visionaries by some and robber barons by others. Beneath their towers of prosperity, workers organized, protested, and sometimes bled for fairness. The labor movement was born from this tension, from the understanding that freedom without justice was hollow. Strikes echoed across the land, in the coal fields of West Virginia, in the factories of Chicago, in the rail yards of Pullman. Men and women stood shoulder to shoulder, demanding not charity but dignity, shorter hours, safer conditions, the right to be heard. Many were met with bullets instead of negotiations, but the spirit of resistance could not be silenced. Meanwhile, the frontier beckoned, vast, wild, and unclaimed by the standards of those who had newly arrived. The push westward became both symbol and reality of America's restless soul. Immigrants joined pioneers in wagons that rolled through dust and danger. They built towns from nothing, carved farms into prairie land, and laid rail lines across deserts and mountains. For every mile conquered, another dream was planted. Yet the march of progress came at the expense of those who had lived on the land long before. The native nations who watched as the horizon filled with strangers. Their hunting grounds vanished, their rivers polluted, their treaties broken. The same story of displacement that had begun centuries earlier continued beneath the shadow of smokestacks and expansion. The nation grew, but its conscience wrestled with what that growth cost. In the growing cities, life was a study in contrasts. The rich built mansions that gleamed with chandeliers and gold, while the poor huddled in tenements that stank of despair. Yet even in the darkest alleys, laughter could be heard, music spilling from windows, the chatter of markets, the prayers whispered in a dozen languages. Out of hardship, culture bloomed. The immigrant heart gave rise to new rhythms, jazz from the blues of the South and the brass of New Orleans, polka from the dance halls of the Midwest, folk songs from the fields and factories. The streets became symphonies of survival. Churches and synagogues stood side by side. Festivals brought color to the gray of industry. Children, born between two worlds, learned to translate both, the old traditions of their parents and the new ideals of their homeland. Education became the ladder to transformation. Immigrant families sacrificed so their children could attend school, believing that knowledge was the true inheritance of freedom. From those classrooms emerged future leaders, artists, inventors, and reformers who would shape the century ahead. They carried within them the dual inheritance of struggle and aspiration. The turn of the 20th century marked both triumph and turmoil. America was no longer a fledgling nation. It was a force of industry, invention, and influence. The light, bulb, the telephone, the automobile, each invention brought new possibilities, shrinking distances and expanding dreams. Yet for all its progress, inequality still pulsed beneath the surface. The dream, though alive, remained unevenly shared. Women began to rise and demand their place in the nation's story. They marched through the streets for the right to vote, their voices echoing alongside laborers and immigrants. Figures like Jane Addams and Emma Goldman stood at the intersection of justice and rebellion, challenging the system to live up to its own ideals. In factories, women organized unions, balancing the burdens of labor with the hope of liberation. America was changing not just in its skyline, but in its soul. Each wave of immigrants, each industrial revolution reshaped its identity. The old world and the new blended in unexpected ways. Italian opera mixed with African rhythm, Eastern European faith met Western democracy. The result was messy, beautiful, and alive. The promise of America had always been that one could arrive with nothing and still build something. For many, that promise proved true. For others, it remained forever out of reach. But through triumph and tragedy, the belief persisted that tomorrow could be better, that the journey itself was sacred. Factories may have blackened the skies, but they also illuminated the horizon of possibility. Immigrant hands laid the foundation of bridges, skyscrapers, and cities that would define the modern world. Their stories became the unseen architecture of the nation, the quiet strength beneath the noise of progress. And as the years rolled forward, those once called outsiders became part of the American heartbeat. Their children spoke the language of the land. Their traditions blended into its seasons. Their blood mingled with its soil. What had once been, many became one, not by erasing difference but by learning to live within it. From Ellis Island to San Francisco Bay, from the slums of New York to the farmlands of the Midwest, the same story echoed, of arrival, endurance, and becoming. The faces changed, the accents varied, but the rhythm was constant, the rhythm of hope. Even as machines replaced muscles and corporations replaced communities, the human spirit refused to fade. Each generation of immigrants carried with it a quiet defiance, a belief that no matter the hardship, no matter the injustice, the dream was worth chasing. For it was not wealth that made America great, but the will of those who came with nothing but faith in the future. They built not only cities and industries, but ideals of equality, opportunity, and perseverance. And though time would bring wars, depressions, and more waves of change, the foundation laid in those early years of immigration and industry would endure. It was a foundation built on sweat and sacrifice, on the courage to begin again, on the endless human capacity to hope. In every city skyline, in every name etched upon the ship's manifests, in every accent that colors the air, their legacy lives on. They were the dreamers who crossed oceans, the builders who tamed iron and steam, the souls who turned hardship into heritage, and under the same sky that welcomed them long ago, their story continues. A story of movement, of melding, of becoming one people out of many. The machinery of progress may fall silent, the factories may fade into history, but the spirit of those who came, weary, hopeful, unbroken, still hums in the heart of America. The story of America has always been written in struggle, in the tension between what is promised and what is lived, between the ideal of equality and the reality of division. Long after the cannons of the Civil War fell silent, the echoes of injustice still rolled through the land. Freedom had been declared but not delivered. The law had changed, but hearts had not. The chains had been broken, yet their shadows still clung to every courthouse, every street, every field where inequality lingered unseen. In the years that followed Reconstruction, the dream of true equality faltered beneath the weight of fear and hate. Across the South, new systems of oppression rose in the ruins of the old. They called it separate but equal. But it was never equal. Segregation painted every wall, every bus seat, every water fountain, marking who belonged and who did not. The ballot box, the classroom, the very right to live freely, all were guarded by laws that whispered the same lie, that freedom had limits and that color defined them. And yet even in that darkness voices rose, quiet at first, then stronger. In churches, in barbershops, in fields, in whispered conversations beneath the stars, a movement began to breathe. It did not begin in the halls of power, but in the hearts of those who refused to bow. It began with mothers teaching their children to stand tall, with fathers walking miles to cast a single vote, with preachers who dared to call injustice by its name. The 20th century opened with the promise of progress and the persistence of prejudice. The Great Migration carried millions of black families northward, away from the violence of the South and into the crowded cities of Chicago, Detroit, and New York. They brought with them not only labor and skill, but culture, the music of jazz, the poetry of Harlem, the rhythm of resilience. In tenements and clubs, a new voice emerged, proud, creative, unafraid. The Harlem Renaissance became a revolution of the spirit, proof that even in a nation that denied equality, brilliance could not be silenced. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay spoke truths that white America could no longer ignore. Their words were not only about pain but about pride, a declaration that beauty, intellect, and dignity belonged to all people. Art became armor, poetry became protest, and still, the nation wrestled with its conscience. World War II brought another test. On distant battlefields, black soldiers fought and died for a freedom they could not fully claim at home. In the segregated barracks and the divided ranks of the military, hypocrisy stood plain. When they returned, heroes were greeted not with honor, but with hostility. Yet they carried with them a new fire, a conviction that if America could fight tyranny abroad, it must also fight it within. Then came the moment when that quiet fire became an inferno. In Montgomery, Alabama, A seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. It was a small act, but it cracked the shell of fear that had held a people captive. When she was arrested, the community rose in her defense. The Montgomery bus boycott began, not just a protest against buses, but against a system. For 381 days, men and women walked miles to work, to church, to school. They endured threats, violence, and exhaustion, but they refused to give in. From that stand rose a young preacher whose voice would carry across generations, Martin Luther King Jr. His words were more than sermons. They were songs of the soul. He spoke of love in the face of hate, of justice rolling down like waters. He did not demand vengeance, but vision. His dream was not for one people, but for all. That the measure of a person would be the content of their character, not the color of their skin. The movement spread like a heartbeat across the South. Sit-ins at lunch counters, freedom rides through burning highways, marches across bridges guarded by police and dogs, each act a note in the anthem of resistance. Young people, some barely, grown faced jail cells and fire hoses with nothing but courage as their shield. They sang as they were dragged away, their voices unbroken even when their bodies were bruised. In Birmingham, children filled the jail so that the world could see what injustice looked like. In Selma, marchers faced batons and tear gas on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Their blood stained the pavement, but their resolve stained history. The images of that brutality shocked a nation and forced the conscience of America to look itself in the mirror. Change came slowly, then all at once. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 sought to restore what had long been denied. But laws alone could not heal centuries of pain. For every victory won, another barrier rose. Economic inequality, red-line neighborhoods, the quiet cruelty of discrimination that no law could fully erase. Yet the movement had awakened something irreversible, a generation that refused silence. The struggle for civil rights became a broader cry for human rights. Women, inspired by the courage of those on the front lines, began to demand equality in the workplace, in politics, in their own homes. Activists like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem challenged the idea that freedom was only a man's right. The feminist movement surged, carrying the message that equality was indivisible, that to deny it to one was to weaken it for all. At the same time, new movements rose for those still unseen. Latino farm workers, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, marched through the fields of California demanding fair wages and dignity. Native Americans occupied Wounded Knee and Alcatraz Island, reclaiming history and demanding recognition for centuries of broken promises. The gay rights movement, ignited at Stonewall in 1969, shouted into the silence, refusing shame, insisting on love as a human right. The spirit of protest became a pulse that moved through the decades. Each generation inherited the unfinished work of the one before. In the 1970s, against the backdrop of war and disillusionment, young people once again filled the streets, calling for peace, for justice, for accountability. They carried signs and songs, using the tools of democracy to challenge the corruption of its dream. By the 1980s and 1990s, new battles emerged, against poverty, against the ravages of disease, against the complacency of those who had forgotten that progress can fade if not protected. Activists fought for the environment, for women's health, for the rights of the disabled, for the dignity of the forgotten. Each cause, each voice became another verse in the long ballad of justice. The fight for equality evolved with time, adapting to new forms of oppression. Where once segregation had stood in plain sight, now discrimination hid behind policy, behind subtlety, But those who carried the legacy of resistance saw through the disguise. They used new weapons, education, media, art, and technology to keep the truth alive. Then came a new century, carrying old wounds into modern light. In cities like Ferguson, Minneapolis, and Baltimore, the cry for justice rose once more. The deaths of unarmed black men and women became symbols of a deeper pain, the unfinished work of a nation still struggling to reconcile its past with its promise. The phrase Black Lives Matter became both a statement and a demand, a reminder that equality was not a memory, but a mission. Millions marched not only in America but across the world, chanting for justice beneath the same sky that had witnessed so much history. Social media became the new town square, where voices once silenced could now reach millions. The struggle for equality found new forms. Hashtags became movements, viral videos became evidence, silence became complicity. The young once again took the torch, their chants echoing those of their ancestors. Different tools, same truth, that freedom must be fought for not once but always. And alongside the fight for racial justice came others, for gender identity, for climate action, for immigrant rights. America's conscience was tested not by whether it could rise from crisis, but whether it could learn from it. The definition of equality expanded, stretching to include all who had ever been pushed to the margins. Through all of it, from the marches of Selma to the protests of today, one truth endured: progress is not a straight line. It bends, it breaks, it rebuilds. Each generation must rediscover what freedom means and who it includes. The fight for equality is the heartbeat of democracy. Fragile, relentless, alive. The voices of justice have never been one, but many, joined in harmony and argument, in unity and discord. They are the teachers who refuse to give up on forgotten students, the lawyers who fought cases no one else would take, the artists who turned pain into poetry, the dreamers who still dare to believe that the world can be kinder. Their victories are often unseen, their defeats painful, but their persistence is eternal, because the fight for equality is not a moment. It is the measure of a nation's soul. Every protester who marches, every voter who casts a ballot, every child who learns that their worth is not up for debate. They are part of the same story that began when the first enslaved person dreamed of freedom, when the first suffragist raised her voice, when the first protester stood alone and refused to move. And so the movement continues not as a chapter closed, but as a living force, evolving, expanding, enduring. The faces change, the battles shift, but the spirit remains. It is the same spirit that marched on Washington, that crossed bridges, that stood before tanks, that knelt in silence. It is the voice that says no to injustice and yes to hope, again and again. America's journey toward equality is far from finished. The dream remains fragile, unfinished, and yet alive. Each generation inherits the weight of its imperfections and the possibility of its redemption. Freedom is not a gift handed down. It is a flame passed forward, and under the same sky that watched the chains fall, the marches rise, the banners wave, and the voices cry out, that flame still burns. It flickers in every act of courage, in every demand for truth, in every hand raised not in anger but in purpose. The fight for equality is the story of America itself, not of perfection, but of persistence. And as long as one person believes that tomorrow can be fairer than today, the voices of justice will never be silenced. Under the same sky that watched over the birth of a nation, America still stands, older, wiser, yet still restless. Its skyline glitters with glass and ambition. Its fields hum with machines and memory. Its people carry both pride and pain in equal measure. The story that began centuries ago is not finished. It lives in every street, every voice, every hand that builds, protests, dreams, and dares. The ink of its history is still wet, The nation continues to write itself, line by line, heart by heart, in a constant conversation between what it is and what it hopes to be. From space, America appears as one, a single glowing shape beneath the turning clouds. But closer, its beauty lies in its fragments, the millions of lives woven together, often frayed, yet bound by something deeper than geography. The hum of the present blends the sounds of old struggles and new beginnings, the chant of protest, the rhythm of music, the buzz of innovation, the hush of reflection. The country moves forward, but never without the weight of its past pressing softly on its shoulders. The cities rise higher than ever, towers of steel and light that touch the clouds. In their streets, languages from every continent flow together like rivers. A single subway car might hold a dozen accents, 1,000 stories. The child of immigrants sits beside the grandchild of settlers. The descendants of the enslaved walk the same avenues as the descendants of those who once enslaved them. Each carries the story of how they arrived, and each in some way still searches for belonging. Technology has reshaped the rhythm of life. The click of typewriters has been replaced by the soft glow of screens. The American dream, once a field or a factory, now lives in servers, satellites, and digital empires. From Silicon Valley to small-town startups, innovation pulses like electricity through the veins of the nation. Ideas become industries overnight. A young coder in their bedroom can build something that reaches millions, just as a single voice online can spark a movement that crosses oceans. But progress, as always, walks hand in hand with peril. The same tools that connect also divide. The web, meant to unite humanity, sometimes amplifies its fractures. Truth and falsehood travel side by side, each wearing the mask of conviction. The same screen that brings knowledge can also carry anger, fear, and confusion. America, more connected than ever, sometimes feels more divided than before. Politics mirrors this paradox. The ideals of liberty and justice are still recited in classrooms and speeches, but in the public square, those words are often bent by conflict. Debates over race, gender, class, climate, and truth itself rage across every channel, every feed. The nation speaks in millions of voices, loud, passionate, hopeful, weary, each insisting on a version of what America should be. The divisions are real, but beneath them lies something older than disagreement, the shared desire to belong to something greater, to believe that the experiment of democracy can still hold. The face of America has changed beyond what the founders could have imagined. Diversity is no longer a side note in its story. It is the story. The country is a living mosaic, shifting and evolving. A classroom in Los Angeles might have students whose families come from a dozen different countries. In the markets of Houston, Miami, and Queens, the scents of 100 kitchens mingle. Spice, smoke, sweetness. Proof that heritage and hope can coexist. Yet with that richness comes the constant question, who are we, together? What does it mean to be American when there is no single face, faith, or tongue that defines it? The answer, elusive and evolving, lies not in sameness but in the struggle to understand difference. The tension between unity and individuality, between pride and humility, has always been the country's paradox and its power. Generations raised on stories of freedom and opportunity now grapple with the cost of both. The dream of prosperity is still alive but unevenly shared. In gleaming cities, fortunes are built at breathtaking speed, while in forgotten towns, factories rust and promises fade. The gulf between wealth and want stretches wide, a silent wound that cuts across politics and race. Yet even in the quiet corners of decline there are sparks. Teachers who refuse to give up on their students, workers who rebuild industries with their hands, communities that rise from ruin through shared will. The earth itself has become part of America's new struggle. Fires scorch forests, storms flood cities, and droughts crack the soil. The land that once seemed endless now demands care. The same rivers that carried pioneers west now carry warnings of change. Scientists speak urgently. Activists march. Young voices rise, demanding stewardship over conquest. A new kind of patriotism takes root, one not defined by borders but by balance. To love the country now means to heal it, to protect the fragile world it stands upon. The echo of past movements still shapes the present. The cries for civil rights, for women's equality, for justice, they continue, renewed in every generation. On the steps of courthouses, in the streets of cities, on campuses and online, people march beneath new banners chanting the old truth, that freedom must grow or it will wither. Black Lives Matter, Me Too, climate strikes, immigration marches. Each is a reminder that the fight for equality did not end. It merely changed form. The same courage that filled Selma's bridges now fills digital platforms and global protests. And yet, even amid the turmoil, there is creation. Artists paint, poets write, musicians mix old rhythms with new beats. Film, literature, and art reflect a country forever questioning itself, unafraid to confront its flaws, unwilling to surrender its hope. The stories told today are more honest, more inclusive, more human. They tell of love that defies labels, of voices once silenced now singing. The arts have become America's conscience, reminding it of its humanity when politics forgets. The young inherit a complex inheritance, a nation both celebrated and criticized, powerful and uncertain. They grow up in a world of information and anxiety, of limitless possibility and heavy responsibility. They have seen the planet in peril, economies shift and justice tested, and still they dream. They start movements in classrooms, build organizations from dorm rooms, turn outrage into action. They carry protest signs and laptops, hope and exhaustion. Yet in them, the pulse of renewal beats strongest. Immigration continues to shape the nation's character, as it always has. New arrivals cross borders not only of geography but of identity. Refugees fleeing war and climate disaster find shelter among strangers who understand the price of starting over. Each arrival is another verse in the ongoing poem of becoming. America, for all its walls and arguments, remains a land that draws the world, because somewhere in its chaos, there is still the promise of becoming something more. Beyond its borders, America's influence still stretches wide, through culture, innovation, and ideals. Its music, movies, and technology touch nearly every corner of the planet. But with that reach comes responsibility. The nation that once saw itself as the world's guiding light now must learn to listen as well as lead. The 21st century demands humility, the understanding that greatness lies not only in power, but in compassion. And so the nation stands at a threshold, between what it has been and what it might yet become. It is divided, yes, but also alive with debate. It argues because it cares. It questions because it hopes. The very noise of its democracy, however chaotic, is proof that the dream still breathes. In every generation, there are moments that test its character, pandemics that pause the world, crises that reveal who is forgotten, elections that divide and define, but each time somehow the country endures, not unscathed but unbroken. The story continues not because it is perfect, but because it refuses to end. In small towns, neighbors still help one another rebuild after storms. In cities, strangers still share tables and laughter. Soldiers still salute the flag, not because the nation is flawless, but because they believe it can be better. Activists still march, teachers still teach, artists still create. The dream remains fragile but alive, because it is held not by the powerful, but by the countless ordinary hands that refuse to let it go. Under the same sky, children still recite the pledge each morning, perhaps not yet understanding its weight but feeling its rhythm. Under that same sky, Elders remember wars, marches, and revolutions, whispering stories of resilience to those who will inherit them. Under that sky the future waits, uncertain, open, vast. The question that began with the birth of the nation still lingers. What does it mean to be free? And perhaps the answer is not a single truth, but a journey, a continuous act of becoming. Freedom, after all, is not the absence of struggle, but the presence of possibility. America today is a reflection of its contradictions, compassionate yet cruel, bold yet fearful, divided yet intertwined, but it is also a reflection of its relentless hope. Its story is not a straight line, but a spiral, returning, revisiting, renewing. Each generation turns the wheel, adding its weight, its wisdom, its wounds. The dream of equality still flickers. The pursuit of justice still climbs. The call to unity still echoes. And in every quiet act of kindness, every word spoken in truth, every bridge built instead of burned, the story continues. Perhaps that is America's truest identity. Not its borders or its battles, not its wealth or its power, but its refusal to stop striving, to fall and rise again, to break and rebuild, to argue and still believe. Under the same sky that watched over its birth, its wars, its marches, and its awakenings, America breathes, imperfect, unfinished, undaunted. Its journey is not over, because the story of freedom never ends. Each voice adds a line, each dream a page, each act of courage a chapter, and somewhere, in the spaces between its triumphs and its failures, its beauty and its flaws, lies the heartbeat of a nation still searching for its truest self, still daring, still dreaming, still alive.